And I think we are now live, and we are pretty much doing very good. The class must be very clear, um, very clean, and we are pretty much doing very good. The class must be able to hear me. Good evening, Bath. Good evening, Prabhuna. And I expect let us wait for quick couple of minutes and let the students join. काफी लोग ज्वाइन होने वाले थे. आज कोई दिक्कत नहीं होना चाहिए. Unlike yesterday. Hmm. Good evening, Harshini. Good evening, Prithviraj. Good evening. Good evening. Okay, so let us begin the discussion. And good evening, Bernika. And in this series of Viceroys classes, so the next I think 2 to 3 sessions today, tomorrow, day after 2 to 3 sessions, we'll be discussing Viceroys of India. Different viceroys, their contributions, what all changes they've done, what all changes they've did, for how long each of these were there. Good evening, Shri Devi. It's very important for you to understand the viceroys because viceroys may say बहुत सारे questions on regular basis. Questions do come in your prelims, and viceroys becomes somewhat different approach because now here we are going to do a chronological approach, not the event-based approach which we do with the regular R Sharma reading or the reading that we do with Spectrum, modern India. Okay, so the office of Viceroy literally means deputy royalty. That's the very concept of Viceroy. See, the reason why Viceroy was even created is company ruled India for approximately 100 years and messed up everything. कंपनी ने बुरी तरह सब कुछ सत्यानाशी कर दिया. 100 years they were ruling and they ruined everything. So now it was the crown's responsibility, and crown had to make sure that the whatever issue happened previously does not repeat. Crown has to make sure that things do not repeat or things do not go bad. Good evening, Jan. Good evening. Good evening. Okay, so those who are not yet part of my Telegram group, do join the Telegram group. Plus students, PL, US, students, STUD, and TS. You can check on Telegram. Having said that, now we are teaching this on Civils Plus IAS Academy. It's getting stuck again, right? Guys, it is getting stuck, right? I don't know, in the mornings it's all fine. I don't know what happens in the evenings. Just give me 1 second, guys. 1 second. Okay, so let us begin the discussion of the first viceroy. The first viceroy was Viceroy Canning. Lord Canning was the viceroy from 1858 to 1862, and he remained the viceroy. Basically, he was a continuing from the East India Company governors. He was essentially a continuity from East India Company governors. Government of India Act 1958 was actually passed during his period, and it established the position of viceroy, which was to be held by the same person who held the same position as Governor General of India. So essentially, Government of India Act 1858 created two positions: the Governor General of India, Viceroy of India. Governor General was the political head. Viceroy was the ceremonial head. Viceroy was the ceremonial head. He was to be in charge. Lord Canning issued the royal proclamation in a spectacular darbar, the November 1st, 1858 November Darbar, where it was informed that Queen Victoria has taken over the government of India. And this proclamation is also generally known as the Act of Good Governance. This is also generally known as the Act of Good Governance. This proclamation is also the Act of Good Governance. Now, the proclamation also outlined the principles by which India was to be ruled. I mean, what principles the British were going to use to rule India. There were a couple of important terms which were clearly mentioned. There were two, three terms which are clearly mentioned. Number one, all of East India Company treaties which East India Company had made with Indian prince and princesses was to be retained as it is. So princely nations would be upheld all their protections which they had from East India Company. The former company's boundaries were not to be extended. So East India Company was not to go for any extensions. Good evening, Saurabh. Good evening, Kunal. There was to be absolutely no encroachment on the British positions in India. And the British were not to intrude on the territories of others. British were to absolutely not intrude onto the territories of others. Just give me 1 second, guys. This is. I'll go off. I think then everything will look fine. Because my video is getting stuck. I don't know what is happening at this time, but हाँ ठीक है. मेरा video निकाल दिया. The former East India Company's boundaries were not to be extended anymore. So no extensions, no colonization, nothing. And there was to be absolutely no encroachments. No more colonization. So basically, what the crown was saying is exactly whatever the company rule was, वही continue होगा. Whatever relationships the Indian princes had with the company, the same thing, crown will also respect and continue. That's what they were saying. So native rights, the rights, the powers, the dignity of the native kings will be respected. And there was a very clear expression which was given for the British subjects to enjoy wealth and social growth exactly the same way that could be achieved only by internal peace and good governance. And the British also agreed that they were obligated to inhabitants of India just in the same way. The crown is actually obligated to provide good governance for the British. Just like how crown has a responsibility for providing good governance for the British subjects, they are going to just do exactly same here again. यहाँ पे भी डिट्टो डिट्टो वही करेंगे. Nothing will change. Now everything is fine, right? Now the voice and everything is fine. Admission to government services offices was to be done absolutely without any disregard or consideration for a race or faith, without considering one's religion, without considering one's race, ethnicity, where they are born, which place they live. Nothing will be considered, when rather decision will be taken purely on the basis of equality. So at least on paper, equality was being promised, except for those who were involved in the murders of British subject or British officers. Others will be given general amnesty for 1857 revolt. For those who did the 1857 revolt, there was a general amnesty which was given. So, guys, clear till here? Everything clear till here? So that's the reason, that this is the basic reason why the Elgin's First Act, the Good Governance Act, is generally known as the Magna Carta of India. Why it is called Magna Carta of India is mainly because of this. The proclamation was dubbed as Magna Carta of the People of India and was declared in eloquent style, in the British style, purely in accordance with the two rules Queen Victoria had insisted for Indians, that is, justice and religious tolerance. Queen Victoria wanted the British government or the crown rule in India to be based on two principles: justice and religious tolerance, and both were duly respected. Both were duly given preference. Now, some other important changes which happened during Canning's period. Number one, on the 1st of September 1858, East India Company convened its final session in India, which declared the ending of East India Company, the shutting down of East India Company. East India Company's armies were to cease to exist after the Queen's proclamation, and the soldiers in India were to become an important part of the British Army, the British Indian Army. So the East India Company Army was to be renamed or replaced as the Indian Army. Soldiers in India. Now, also, the Indian sepoys were to be enlisted in the regular British service as well. Even in the regular British service of Britain, Indians could now apply, because now Indians were basically termed British subjects. So they were by default not part of any discrimination, or they were not to be discriminated at any cost. That's the reason Government of India Act 1858 is generally called the Act of Good Governance. It is generally called the Act of Good Governance. Everything, हर चीज वो था जिसकी वजह से रिश्ते खराब हुए थे previously. Every point because of which the relations between the British East India Company and Indian princes and zamindars ruined, everything was addressed. On the 2nd of August 1858, Government of India Act 1858 was actually formally given a royal accent, and it came to force on 1st of November 1858. That's the reason the Queen's proclamation happened on 1st of November. Now remember this. The act was passed in August 2nd, 1858. The proclamation was given later. Got it? Chronology. Proclamation came later in November Act itself passed in August. Exactly. So the proclamation came later, Act passed before. The Act provided for liquidation of East India Company as well and transferred all the powers of government to the British Crown, basically to the Queen. Now, how this was to be done? The powers of East India Company had two units called the Board of Control, Court of Directors previously. As of 1784 Pitt's India Act, those two were now out, and a Secretary of State for India was created, who was essentially was to be a cabinet minister. Secretary of State for India was to be there, who was to be a cabinet minister. Now, this new office of Secretary of State of India was to have complete, unquestioned, total authority on the British administration of India. They would control over the Indian administration. They will control everything about Indian administration. Now, the Secretary of State for India was also a member of the British Parliament. He was responsible to the British Parliament only. So, in a way, responsible government was also coming. Now, responsible government to the British Parliament, not to Indians. Not responsibility to Indians, but responsibility to the British. That was being done. Yes, political and commercial functions were out. Now there was to be one in single government which was to do everything. There was to be one single government which was to do everything. The Secretary of State for India was to be addressed or was to be assisted by a council of 15 members. Secretary of State for India was to be assisted by a 15-member council. Now, these 15 members were to be in London only. Guys, I'm loud and clear, right? These 15 members were to be in London only. Okay. And among these 15, 50% of the members must have been somebody who has lived in India for a period of at least 10 years. People who would have lived in India for a period of at least 10 years were to make minimum 50%, 50% of this Secretary of State's Council. Now, essentially, the British members of Parliament also could ask questions for the Secretary of State for India on matters relating to Indian administration. That's why we call this first attempt at responsible government. इसीलिए इसको responsible government कहते हैं. See, there was at least the provision, not Indian, but at least British members of Parliament could question the Indian administration about its working. इससे पहले East India Company would not answer anybody. And Governor General basically worked as the representative of the British government and was responsible for the administration of the country. So basically, Governor General became de facto ruler. Governor General of India became the de facto ruler of India. Plus, a new office called Viceroy was created to work essentially as a diplomat to parley or to discuss, to do negotiations with the princely states. Because essentially there were two parts in British India, the British provinces, and there were also these princely states. No, दो अलग अलग थे. ये तो चलेगा, क्राउन उठा लेगा. What about these guys? And many of these princely states are not even subsidiary allies. They were independent also. And some of these were very, very trusted allies. That's why a separate office was created. The only benefit which was done is, instead of keeping two different people one person was to be the Governor General and the Viceroy. So both offices of Governor General holding the British provinces and the Viceroy holding the discussing with the princely states was to be run by the same person. Viceroy was made the sole representative and responsible for the Secretary of State for India. Got it? So during Canning's period, you would agree with me if I said that substantially everything changed. Government of India Act 1858 resulted in a highly centralized structure. In fact, it gave a proper structure to the government, at least for the first time. Further, it was also only a formal change case. To be honest, no, Viceroy mentioned in 1858, Government of India, Sitadri. Viceroy word is mentioned in 1858 Government of India Act. उसमें है. सच तो ये है that the change was essentially formal. Instead of the East India Company insignia, they basically replaced it with crown insignia. Or else, Baki, a lot changed in paper, nothing changed really in practice. The discrimination, the changes, the race and creed based discriminations, all that continued. जो जो ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के साथ गलत था वो सब वैसे ही रहा, कुछ नहीं बदला. Yes, nothing changed. Then, see, this was mainly the guys Canning's biggest change. The structure. So Canning gave a structure to the government during Canning's period. The next biggest important during Canning's period is Indian Councils Act 1861. For the first time, Indians became part of the government. It was passed in Parliament in 1861 during Canning's period. With this act, Governor General's already crowded executive gained a fifth financial member. So, financial member was added. See, यहाँ पे already by this time Governor General's councils had Governor General plus 4. Now another guy was added. Financial member. Apart, see, Governor General had an executive which consisted of 5 members. Apart from these, 6 to 12 legislative members were also added. 6 to 12 legislative members were also added, mainly for the purpose of formulating laws. Rather than the same legislative members or legal members were also added. An extra to give us kind of structure. 6 to 12 legislative members were also. And for the convenience of administration, the Governor General was given many new powers. Like, for example, he could do portfolios. Basically, he could begin decentralization of duties. Portfolio system was invented here. Now, what was the portfolio system? Legislation was also to give the Governor General authority to allocate specific tasks to individuals. We call this the Great Portfolio System. ये इसी पे हुआ था, where the members of executive and India's portfolio system also began. This is what later became the ministerial system, no? For example, Sitadri, my voice is coming very clear. I think your side the volume is very low. Guys, others, though, is the voice very clear? I think it's all clear on my side, so please check that. It also provided for the governments of Bombay, Madras legislature to have their own legislative authority or law-making authority, resulting in some amount of decentralization. So, during Canning's period, an attempt was done to create a centralized government. At the same time, attempt was also done to get a decentralization system established. So both was done perfectly. Both was done perfectly. Portfolio system government. Okay, this was also passed during Viceroy Canning's period. As part of the, according to this act, any person, whether Indian or European, could be appointed to any of the offices listed in the Act's schedule if he had lived in India for at least 7 years. So, if you have lived in India for 7 years, you would be having um, domicile. Domicile. If you are living in India, you will have domicile. Domicile in India. In the mornings, we actually have absolutely no disturbance with the internet, right? I don't know why this happens in the evenings. Morning, we had a fantastic class without any challenge. The individual who had to pass a test in vernacular language of the districts in which he or she worked. So, individual bureaucrats who were to work in India, they had to take a vernacular test. It was required. Vernacular test was required. They had to. So, Indian Civil Service Act. The same Civil Service Act also, however, stated that some of India's most important government jobs were reserved only for Indians. So, the covenanted civil service became like the upper class civil service, where and then the non-covenanted became dedicated for Indians. Covenanted only Europeans, non-covenanted only Indians. This difference was also done. Indians were requesting admittance into covenant civil service at that time, but obviously this demand was never really accepted or never really agreed. This was never agreed. Bureaucrats who were to work in India, they had to take our application. Finally, Indian High Courts Act was also passed during Lord Canning's period, Viceroy Canning's period. Indian High Courts Act. Indian High Courts Act was basically an act which merged previously existing Supreme Courts, Sadar Diwani Adalat and Sadar Faujdari Adalats together. Previously, we had the Sadar Diwani Adalats and Sadar Faujdari Adalats. They were all merged up into a single sort of court system called the High Court System. High Court System. And for this, Queen Victoria even gave the grant letters of patent for establishment of Calcutta High Court, Madras High Court, and Bombay High Court. Calcutta High Court, Madras High Court, and Bombay High Court. The High Courts actually took over the jurisdiction of Supreme Courts, Sadar Diwani Adalats, and Sadar Faujdari Adalats. If you remember, during Cornwallis's period, This Sadar Diwani Adalat, Sadar Faujdari Adalat and the Supreme Courts were actually created. मतलब Supreme Court was already there. उसके नीचे, if you remember, Munsif Court, Circuit Court, Sadar Diwani Adalat, Sadar Nizamat Adalats were all established during that period only. Each of the High Court was to be constituted with one Chief Justice and 15 judges. One Chief Justice and 15 judges according to the High Courts Act passed during Viceroy Canning. Chief Justice and 15 judges. At least 3 regular judges, including Chief Justice, had to be barristers, basically lawyers or educated in law from London. And 1/3 of the judges had to be from the Covenant Civil Service. So 1/3 of the 15, which is about 5, were to be from the Covenant, plus 3 of them, Chief Justice and 2, 3 of them were to be barristers. So essentially, in total, there are 16, no? 15 plus 1. Among these 15 plus 1, 8 were to be barrister, 8 were to be pro-British barristers, 8 were to be regular Indian educated judges type of guys. ये मॉडल था. And eventually it is this high court system only we follow even today. आज तक we follow that only. We follow this only even today. The High Court of Judicature of Fort Williams was actually formed on July 1st, 1862, with Sir Barnes Peacock as its first Chief Justice. According to the letters, patent issued by Queen for the establishment of High Courts. So eventually, dhire dhire, the High Courts were established. And eventually, Calcutta High Court became one of the first courts to be established, the Calcutta High Court. And उसमें भी Justice Shambhunath Pandit became the first Indian judge in the Calcutta High Court in 1863. So Calcutta High Court was established in 1862. Justice Shambhunath Pandit became the first judge in 1863 itself. The Bombay High Court was created on August 14th, 1862. And eventually on the 26th of June, 1862, Madras High Court received its letter of patents, and eventually Madras High Court was also established. So as of 1862, multiple courts were established. Calcutta High Court, Madras High Court, Bombay High Court. And in 1866, 4 years later, extra court was established for northwestern provinces, basically in Agra. इसको बाद में 69 में the Agra High Court was shifted to Allahabad. And in 2016, Allahabad High Court celebrated 150 years of its establishment. 150 years of Allahabad High Court also happened in 2016. Finally, just before he left the country, during Canning's period, couple of important changes happened. Number one, 1862, Indian Penal Code was finally brought into establishment. Previously, during Macaulay's period, the Indian Law Commission was established. Lord Macaulay drew the first draft of Indian Penal Code back in the 1830s, but nothing really could be done with that. It was finally then fully drafted in the 1860 and put into effect in 1862. Macaulay was the first Law Commission member or the legal member, the judicial member of the Governor General's Executive. In 1861, the final draft of the Codes of Civil and Criminal Procedure Codes was completed. And finally, prior to 1860, India used to follow English criminal law. But after that, we started to have Indian Penal Code for primarily implemented initially in the presidency towns of Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. Dhire dhire karke it was implemented across the country without leaving anybody. So after independence, Pakistan acquired the same, and it came to be known as Indian Penal Code came to be known as Pakistan Penal Code, the Bangladesh Penal Code, and eventually so on and so forth. Ceylon, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, everybody agreed. Everybody took this. Malaysian Civil Code, Singapore, Burma, Sri Lanka, Brunei Darussalam, everybody adopted this very exact Indian Penal Code of 1862. 1862 का यही पिनल कोड आज तक बहुत सारे फॉर्मर ब्रिटिश कॉलोनीज में इंप्लीमेंट किया जाता है. इट स्टिल फॉलोड इन ऑल द ब्रिटिश प्रोविंसेस ऑफ मेनी regions. Okay, now Canning is also known for something very interesting. For the first time during Lord Canning's period, we see income tax reforms. In fact, proper income tax was introduced. Remember the financial member? He was introduced as part of Councils Act 1861. The first financial member was James Wilson. He proposed different types of taxes, but it could not get implemented. Finally, his successor was Lang. Lang suggested only one tax in India, the income tax. And eventually, this very income tax became central to India. Income tax of 5% was to be imposed on the incomes of rupees 500 or more in a year. So if anybody earns 500 rupees or more, he was to be given an income tax of 5%. 5% income tax. Government also substantially reduced its military and civilian expenditures. Substantially and significantly. It reduced the amount of expenses it was doing, and mainly to improve money. The salt charges were raised. So salt became a major extra tax. Eventually, at one point, salt contributed nearly 8% of British administration's revenues in India. 8%, nearly 8%. During Canning's period, we also see the Bengal Rent Act 1859, which was basically happening as a result of the Bengal dispute, the Bengal Rent Act 1859, because of the Bengal farmers' protest, mainly against the mainly for tenancy protection. Bengal farmers were being exploited by their zamindars, and they raised in a protest. The law was actually introduced by Lord Canning in order to improve landlord-tenant relations, essentially to improve landlord-tenant relations. Landlord tenant relations. See, basically, hota kya tha is the Bengal farmers were completely victimized by the zamindars and landlord. The main goal of this Bengal Tenancy Act was to regulate and strengthen peasants' position against their landlord by clearly clarifying the rights of the riots and limiting the landlord's ability to arbitrarily or randomly increase rent, and also to end evictions, to end sudden without reason evictions. It happened. Farmers who actually held a land for rent or for lease for at least 20 years on the same rent were believed to be entitled to the Bengal tenancy protections, and eventually it became one of the strongest tenancy reforms done by any viceroy in the history. It is also agreed that the rent could not be increased until a court inquiry is completed. So, if a farmer has stayed in a place or rented a place for 20 years, any increase in rent in such places cannot be done until a proper court inquiry is conducted. You see, this remains active even today. If you remember, that's the reason most of the house owners and landlords do lease agreements only for 11 months, not for 12. थोड़ा थोड़ा inspiration यही है. It also gave riots the ability to rent their land. So any riot, if he is taking a land from a landlord, he can sublease it. Sublease or subrent system was also permitted in this entire game. Sublease or subrent, ये भी था. It could also be done without any challenges. Finally, tea mania. Now, this is a very interesting thing which happened during Canning's period. The tea mania. This is quite interesting actually what happened. See, by 1860, tea from Assam had begun to gain its traction in Europe. In fact, Assam tea had become one of the most important commodities of export for the British Crown from India. People loved Assam tea. And naturally, the British government used a policy called the Wasteland Settlement Resettlement Policy, which existed from 1850 to 1860, to make enormous expanses or expansion into all the wastelands. So basically, what they did is any of these wastelands available in Assam, northeast region could be happily leased to be converted into tea farms. Aram se, without any interest for growing tea. In fact, the beauty of this was so nice that Lord Canning further liberalized this land resettlement policy, where he introduced very fee simple rules where anybody could buy lands, where anybody could buy lands without any clearance requirements for charges up to just 2 rupees 80 paisa to 5 rupees per acre. By 1860, actually, voice is coming very clear on my side. I don't know what's happening. Guys, for all others, is it fluctuating? On my side, it is perfect. On my side, it is actually perfect. I'm not having any issues. Anyways, 2.2 rupees 80 paisa to 5 rupees per acre. इतना सस्ते में anybody could get a land and put tea farms. This eventually led to crazy and frenetic expansion of the tea plantations. In fact, there was literally a tea boom in Assam. Assam went into craziness of tea. This tea boom is called the Great Tea Mania of Assam. Happened during Canning's period. The tea mania was marked by resale of tea gardens, as well as deceptions of sale of such lands as with newly planted tea plants as productive tea estates. In fact, there were also many cheating cases which were filed because even within Britishers they were selling and reselling lands as fake lands. Completely. Assam tea eventually gained popularity throughout Lord Canning's reign. In fact, Assam tea is popular even today. Assam tea is one of the most popular commodities as of today. As of today, yes, one of the most popular commodities. Finally, see, canning is also commonly called clemency canning. Mainly because of the general amnesty he actually gave. The reason I'll tell you. Canning is somebody who also faced the 1857 revolt. Once he became the viceroy, he did not take the path of revenge, vengeance, or anger. Thanks to Canning's policy, British were able to regain the trust of the people in India. Following the 1857 mutiny, Canning's administration did not go for retribution against Indians. It did not go for punishment policy or revenge or retribution or taking complaint. And in fact, at a time when the national movement was about to begin, it was Canning's liberal policies which instilled some sort of faith in Indians about the British. Some faith. Canning also favored Indian traders who aided the British during the revolt. Exactly. It is carrot policy. Canning also favored the British, favored Indian traders uh, who aided the British during the revolt. All sort of exemptions were given for the people. Finally, last act done by Lord Canning was he repealed doctrine of lapse, never to be reinterpreted. He removed doctrine of maladministration as well, never to be um, restarted, and that it would depart once the situation had returned to normal. See, basically, Canning clearly said that British will not interfere in the internal issues of Indians. If there is misgovernance, British will come, fix, then leave. No annexations. British would depart once the situation had returned to normalcy. He was given the name Clemency Canning because of his gentle, tolerant attitude towards Indians. And Lord Canning eventually left India in March 1862. He died in England a month later, and Lord Elgin came as a successor to Lord Canning. Canning stayed in India from 1858 to 1862, and during his period, the main things that we basically see is Magna Carta, Councils Act, Civil Service Act, High Courts Act, Tea Mania, Clemency. Main things we observe. Canning retired and left India in poor health. And see, he's been in India for a long period. He came to India in 1856, actually. Then he saw the 1857 revolt, controlled it. Then continued in India as the Viceroy. He left India. He was eventually within India for his distinguished service. He was also given a promotion in ranking. He was given the earldom for his services in India. He died on the 17th of June 1862, just a few months after returning to England. Eventually, Canning was buried in Westminster Abbey. So, Canning's contributions are very important from 1858 to 1862. And most important is clemency. Canning was then followed by Lord Elgin. Elgin won 1862. In 1862 came Lord Elgin. Elgin was a distinguished serviceman, second viceroy. He was in India only for 1 year, 62 to 63. You able to hear me, guys? You able to hear me, guys? Okay. So we'll finish off Elgin. Elgin basically was coming to India only for 1 year, 1862 to 63, only for 1 year. Small term. He was from a very distinguished educational background. He was a student at Eton College. He was a contemporary and friend of Dalhousie and Canning. He's been a colleague of Dalhousie and Canning. He comes from a very strong background. Previously, he has been the High Commissioner. You can say plenipotentiary literally means a diplomat of Britain in China. And he's also been very close to Japan and mainly important in promoting the Japanese trade with Britain, British and Japanese trade. In fact, he was the guy who fought the China's second Opium War. It is in this second Opium War that Britain gained the access to Hong Kong. Britain gained the control of Opium War. And Elgin is also known to have a summer palace in Beijing. It is actually known to have destroyed it. He was also responsible for signing the Peking Convention, under which Kowloon Peninsula under the control of the British. During Elgin's period, Elgin maintained a very low profile for the period he was in India. As much as he was in India, he maintained a sort of low profile. During his period, he was able to completely control the Wahhabis. In fact, the Indian law, he only was responsible for it, controlling Wahhabis.